Great. Well, let me welcome everyone. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm a senior advisor to Bridging the Gap and co-editor of the Bridging the Gap book series with Oxford University Press, and delighted to welcome you to this session on managing detours, dead ends, and self-doubt in writing a dissertation and then turning it into a book. And I'm just going to briefly tell the story of how this webinar was inspired, because it was inspired by the one person on the panel I have not met in person, and that's Dr. Lindsay Mayka. I'm going to tell this story briefly just because it gives me an opportunity to highlight something important that is tangential to the webinar, and that is if you are eligible for an award for a conference paper, article, dissertation, or book, submit. Nominate yourself. This is not about whether you win the award or not. It's about getting your work known by others in the field. And that's how I learned about Lindsay's work. I was on a committee last year, and her book's fantastic. And my comment to the other committee members when we were discussing it was, can you imagine what a beautiful dissertation this must have been? It just was just so well done, so well structured. And it got me thinking that, okay, even people like Lindsay who write amazing dissertations and books inevitably confront detours, dead ends, and self-doubt along the way. And so maybe it would be good for those who are going through the process now if I brought together a group of people who have produced amazing work to talk about dealing with the difficult times in the life of a project. And so I thought immediately of Dr. Adam Auerbach and Dr. Elizabeth Saunders, and was glad that they were agreed to join. And then because we work so closely with Dave McBride at Oxford University Press, and since we publish revised dissertations in our book series, it was natural to ask him to join us. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panel. We'll go from there. I'm going to start the conversation, but please submit your questions through the Q&A or chat function, and Catherine Urban will collect them for me. And so our panel, so as I mentioned, Dr. Adam Auerbach, who's assistant professor at the School of International Service at American University and is the author of Demanding Development, the Politics of Public Goods Provision in India's Urban Slums, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. The doctoral dissertation on which Demanding Development is based won the Best Fieldwork Award from the Comparative Democratization section of the APSA, Best Dissertation Award from the Urban and Local Politics section of APSA, and APSA's Gabriel Almond Award for Best Dissertation in Comparative Politics. And in 2019, he received the Clarence Stone Scholar Award from the APSA Urban and Local Politics section. Dr. Lindsay Mayka is Associate Professor of Government at Colby College, the author of Building Participatory Institutions in Latin America, Reform Coalitions and Institutional Change, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. The dissertation on which the book is based won the 2013 Latin American Studies Association Oxfam Diskin Dissertation Award, granted to the dissertation that best combines scholarly rigor with a commitment to activism. And in 2020, she received the Clarence Stone Scholar Award from the APSA Urban and Local Politics section. And then Dr. Elizabeth M. Saunders, Associate Professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and senior editor at the Washington Post political science blog, The Monkey Cage. She's the author of Leaders at War, How Presidents Shape Military Interventions, published by Cornell University Press in 2011. And her book received the 2012 Jervis Schroeder Best Book Award from APSA's International History and Politics section. And our three scholars are joined by David McBride, the editor-in-chief of the Social Sciences at Oxford University Press, where in addition to his many other responsibilities, he serves as the editor for the Bridging the Gap book series, which launched in 2018 and publishes theoretically grounded policy relevant research. So we're going to start with discussing the dissertation phase. I want to start with Lindsay and then go to Elizabeth and Adam. And to get us going, I would like to ask each panelist to describe 1 to 2 examples of a detour, dead end, or moment of self-doubt that they had to work through during the dissertation phase. Lindsay, please.
All right. So thanks for bringing us all together. And I especially love the focus of the panel, that it's not on, oh, here's how you become successful, but the ways that this process is inherently going to involve a lot of frustration. And this has been a really interesting process of thinking back and reflecting back to the dissertation. I even opened it up with my hands over my eyes. But maybe think back to September of 2011, when I had just come back, or 2010, I had just come back from doing 2 years of field work in Brazil and Colombia. And I had been so immersed in the data and what was going on. I knew a lot of stuff. I had some ideas thinking around, but I didn't know how it all fit together. And so that's just the first thing that I would say, that I think I spent a good semester having no idea. I think I knew what my question was, but beyond that, I did not know what I was doing. And I was just trying to sort through, what did I even have at that point? And so I always struggled a lot with organization and figuring out what was like the oomph. You know, for a book, you can't have like a really complex argument, even if there's a lot of complex pieces. You have to have something that you say, this is what the book is trying to argue, to simplify it. And you're building off of something that you're spending for so long. So coming back in the midst of all of this mess, and the thing that I just had to do to get started is just start writing things. And since I was so paralyzed about what was the main independent variable or the combination, is this, you know, is this antecedent, is this intervening, what's the focus? I tabled that for later, and just started writing memos. And that's how I thought of it, that I was never working in chapters. So I just wrote memos that like I had to write something about this and I had no idea where it was going to go. By the time I got my job here at Colby, I had written a total of 1 chapter, I think, and then I was supposed to be starting in the fall, but I had tons of memos. And so I think that, I don't know, there's just like, there's the feeling of drowning with so much that you have and not knowing how to pull it together. And I think it was also very stressful for my now husband, because he had no idea if I was just stuck. And I didn't entirely feel like I was not, I knew I wasn't going to not finish, but I couldn't have told you when exactly I would be done. And I took a long time. And one thing I just was thinking about this, I think there's 2 truisms, pieces of advice that people say, which is that the best dissertation is a done dissertation, and that you should write your dissertation as a book. And I think to some degree that these can be kind of contradictory, because if you're just focused on cranking it out and not figuring out things, you might struggle with putting it together later on. So I don't know, I wrote my dissertation a little bit closer to how it would end up as a book, but it took a lot longer, and it felt like I wasn't making as much progress because I wasn't just cranking out chapters. I was trying to figure out things along the way. So I don't know if that's advice for people to slow down and take longer on their PhDs. I don't know, but.
Oh, I'm so glad I asked, because it turned out so beautifully. So I knew that everybody has struggled. So I'm glad my intuition was correct. And again, congratulations on such a wonderful product at the end of the day. Elizabeth.
Thanks. And thanks for inviting me to this and inviting me to relive the experience and horror that was the dissertation phase. And I'm really glad to have heard Lindsay's perspective initially, because it feels so similar to mine. And people would give you one piece of advice I got from multiple people was like, take a book off your shelf and like find the books that you really admire that you wish you'd written and try to write them that way. But the problem is what you see in the finished product is the polished version, not the tortured, versions on which you had to basically like do open heart surgery on it 4 times along the way, or whatever the version of your kind of mess of soupy thoughts and data that eventually becomes the beautiful final product, hopefully. So I asked my husband, with whom I've basically been locked in the house with our kids for a year, I told him I was doing this, and I said, well, what do you remember as my worst dissertation moments? And he looked at me like, well, first of all, he said, that was such a long time ago. So I feel like the of the 3 of us, I think I'm the furthest away from it. But then he said, like, how long do you have? There were a lot, and he saw them all, and it was really hard. My dissertation, it took forever. I had the same feeling of, I know all this stuff. I've been to these archives. I have so many documents. What exactly am I doing? and how do I put it together? So I'll just tell two sort of small pieces of it. So I was thinking what it must be like to write a dissertation in the circumstances of the pandemic, which is very lonely and isolating. And I was thinking back to, I actually had to leave my home base, the place where I was, where my graduate school was, because my now husband got a job and I moved with him. And I thought it would be better to have his support and have to commute. Luckily, it wasn't very far, rather than commuting, like me staying, us being apart for that time. And so I ended up basically in the library of a university where we were living. And so I got in library access, but a lot of days it was just me, and the only other person I would talk to is the checkout person at the library. And it was extremely lonely and isolating. And it's not exactly the same. I don't mean to like claim that it's the same, but it's similar enough. And so that was a problem, and there was no Zoom, and so I don't think I really recognized that really made it harder. So anything you can do to kind of break through and reconnect with your peers is good. And so one day I took the train. I took a trip for the day to go to some event and meet people and my advisors. And I was so stuck. I had been working on this case study about Lebanon in the 1950s. And I just could not figure out, like, what is this dissertation fundamentally arguing or even about? And I had this dear friend who had an office in the department, and I went to her office and I plopped in her chair and I just said, I just don't know what this is about. And she said, well, tell me where you are. And I told her. I just sort of like verbally like vomited my dissertation onto her desk in a way. And so she said, so you're saying that some leaders think about it this way and other leaders think about it that way? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, that's a good theory. And no one had ever said that to me before. Like, I didn't know what it meant to have a theory, even though I'd read so many theories. And I had I had good advisors, but it's hard to know until you do it, right? And when she said that, it was like, oh. And of course, it then took a while to kind of like refine it. And, it wasn't like I was done that day with my argument, but at least it pointed me to like, what is the thing I'm aiming for? And she really helped me narrow it down. I mean, it was like maybe a 5-minute conversation. But the point being, and this is kind of a theme that returns in the book phase, like, find your people. Part of the way out of getting stuck is you got to find your people, and the people who can. All she did, which was incredibly valuable, was mirror back to me what I had told her in a different way. And we didn't study the same thing. It doesn't have to be somebody who knows everything. In fact, sometimes it's about your topic. Sometimes it's better if it's someone who doesn't know anything about your topic. But find your people, someone you trust that you can give your unformed ideas to and bounce them off. And it's a really helpful way to get unstuck. The other thing I would say that my husband reminded me of was I went through what he calls my bank teller phase, which is that I kept saying, I just want to be a bank teller or some job that ends at 5 o'clock and I can turn my brain off. And I really hated the feeling, and sometimes I still feel this, of just, you quit at whatever time of day you quit and you just cannot turn your brain off no matter what else you're doing. And it starts to interfere with your ability to make conversation about other things. And it's a bit of an occupational hazard in what we do, but it can be exhilarating in sometimes, but it's really, I went through a phase where it was actually really detrimental to my ability to think about anything, much less my dissertation. So, and I have no idea, like, I just kept thinking, like, I just want a job that ends at 5 o'clock and I'm done with it. So that feeling, I don't think I really recognized that I needed a hobby or something else to have an outlet. And I was not very good at that. And I've gotten better at that over the years. Kids are a good, I didn't have kids at the time. And, when you have to quit and play with your baby on the floor, that kind of forces you to think differently. So, And then the last thing I'll say about this kind of phase, although it's not for my dissertation, I proposed, worked on, and then completely abandoned a second project. And I think one of the things that you don't really learn, and no amount of professionalization can really teach you this, at least I don't think, is like when a project is really just not doable or when you should abandon it. And I just decided this was not the right project for me. And I changed projects, and now I'm working on a much better second project that's way better suited to my interests and my skills and my knowledge. And I think it's really important to understand whether it's a paper, some papers become dead ends, side projects become dead ends, but it's not, it's part of the process, right? I mean, studies fail. Look at the vaccine trials, right? There are some vaccines that are not going to pan out, even though we're hearing in the news all about the J&J one was just advanced today. So, just be prepared for that kind of thing to happen. And it doesn't mean you failed. It just means you are able to recognize that it's time to move on to something else that's better suited to your talents and the scope of what you can do. So I have other things to say, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks. Adam.
Jim, thanks so much for having me on the panel here. This topic is just so immensely important, and it's far too often left for really informal, fragmented conversations among individuals. So it's so exciting that you thought to organize some much more systematic discussion on this. Things that should be acknowledged broadly. And it's so wonderful to be here on the panel with Elizabeth, Lindsay, and David too. A lot of my comments mirror what Lindsay and Elizabeth actually already mentioned. In reflecting on the dissertation writing phase, for me, it was absolutely riddled, with self-doubt. I too was sort of wondering, I could talk about this for hours. How much time is Jim gonna, give me here? But, to condense and limit, some of my responses to just a few points. And again, they really do mirror what Lindsay and Elizabeth, had mentioned too. But a real first major hurdle for me was, really did stem from my field work as well, that these were not sort of discrete periods, in the dissertation process. So after I defended my prospectus in my third year, like Lindsay, I spent just under 2 years doing, pretty intensive field work in India, day-to-day ethnographic field work, archival research, a larger survey. After this period, returning back to Madison, Wisconsin, I'm a proud Badger. I was confronted with a huge challenge that I'm sure is actually quite common, but I was not at all equipped or prepared for it. And that was really what Lindsay had already articulated. How do you assess months and months of observations, survey data, and turn this thing into something that hangs together coherently as a dissertation. That was and continues to be largely not self-evident. And even with a fairly clear, or somewhat crystallizing theoretical framework, I wasn't sure how to weave all this together and even process the fieldwork experience, not even just in terms of analyzing data, but emotionally, having spent, several years doing, really intensive sort of work, becoming friends with people in the field. And so I experienced, really significant whiplash going from intensive field work to, back in, Madison, trying to get back into a writing groove. I found that to be immensely challenging. And I think, what really, really got me through that is what Elizabeth had mentioned, working with a small group of graduate school friends. I would absolutely, I don't know how the dissertation would have gotten done without them. Daily trips to coffee shops, in our little group, providing a space to, complain about setbacks and celebrate, little victories in writing, talking about our dissertation fieldwork, and just being around other people that are experiencing that same process that's quite unique. And I realize people are productive in very, very different ways, like I'm sure everybody else, you have friends that like to work in sort of isolation. But for me, this was a deeply social process. And that was really, really essential for me. A separate line of advice that I got from one of my mentors during the dissertation writing phase 2 was that, not every interview, not every idea, not every descriptive statistic or statistical analysis needs to make it into the dissertation. You're going to have other opportunities to, spin things off as articles. If you choose to, turning this thing into a book at some point in the future. I also benefited tremendously from coming up with a timeline with my dissertation committee, of sending them small, very, very small chunks of the dissertation, not chapters. I mean, even, sections that made it much more, digestible on a day-to-day basis. I have this little smaller discrete section to get finished. And I'll seek feedback on that. And it made it much less of an intimidating process to think of the dissertation as a whole versus smaller sort of pieces. The last thing I'll say, and something that I really wish I had in graduate school, but from what I gather is sort of an increasingly common thing, is seeing the dissertation version of books that I really, really admire, that deeply inspired my own work. And so, as an example, Noah Nathan, a professor up at Michigan who studies African politics, is doing something I think is really, really innovative. And if I have the privilege to teach a PhD class, here at AU in the future, it's something that I certainly would want to do. He's having his PhD students in his comparative politics field seminar read, new comparative politics books that just came out, and ask the authors to share their dissertation prospectuses for them to read both of these things. And so I sent, Noah my dissertation prospectus, and I looked at it similar to what Lindsay sort of mentioned, looking at her dissertation. And I definitely cringed, a handful of times at the writing and what I was proposing to do. But I think that this is just so important, demystifying this process, that there are so many small and large challenges that emerge, for everybody, in different shapes and forms, and that, these, the end process of the dissertation or the book is definitely not what it initially looked like for the vast majority of people, certainly myself included.
Great. Well, let's move on to the, oh, sorry, Lindsay, did you have something?
No, I was just going to say that with what Adam and I really resonate the social aspect of it. One thing that I think would be great now, since we can't go to coffee shops, that I started doing about a year ago, is just doing Zoom writing dates, where I log on for a couple hours and we both mute ourselves and we're just there, but we're not talking, we're just there. And then we're just writing. And then something will come up and I'll ask the person a question. But it's nice, especially when we're all scattered throughout the country and we feel so isolated. It's a little thing, but has really helped me actually write and have like a positive relationship with writing.
Great. All right, so we're going to move away from the dissertation's done. Congratulations, you're hooded. And now we're turning it into a book, and I'm going to go back to the three professors, and then we're going to turn to Dave to see how it looks from the editor's standpoint. But Adam, let's start with you this time on then things that came up as you were preparing to move from the dissertation phase to the publication phase.
Absolutely. And I think this process was even more rocky for me than the dissertation, for lots of different reasons. I mean, I certainly experienced lots of episodes of, self-doubt and other challenges in converting the dissertation, into the book, especially those first 2 years, for me, at least on the tenure clock at AU. I mean, the first thing, and I'm sure this is quite common, but I was just absolutely and totally exhausted, mentally and physically, from the dissertation, field work, going on the job market. And I think this was paired with what I'm sure was pretty crushing sort of imposter syndrome, if we can sort of stray into that territory as well. That Jim, you had mentioned that I was lucky to win a couple dissertation awards, and I was very proud of my dissertation and worked on it really hard. But I didn't expect that it was going to win awards, and this really sort of raised expectations for me about this book better be really, really good. I don't deserve this sort of attention for this, or how did I get a tenure track job? And so happy to talk about that more sort of in the Q&A. And I think having been in many more conversations with people going through this process, I think those sorts of feelings are actually very, very common, and it can be really useful talking to people about them. But yeah, I mean, I totally spun my wheels the first semester at AU. I would just get absolutely mired in thinking, this sentence isn't good enough, this paragraph isn't good enough. I'm not really feeling it. I'm not feeling inspired. Another big challenge for me was that I wrote my dissertation sort of as a hybrid between a book and an article-based dissertation, where there was an introduction chapter and a conclusion chapter, but the chapters in the middle had their own sort of mini theoretical frameworks and empirical analyses. And so it was going to involve a lot of revisions and changing the dissertation, or turning the dissertation into a book. And cutting large parts of the book that were, the dissertation that were, really hard to let go of. So I went through lots of different moments, those first 2 years on the tenure clock, thinking, maybe I don't want to write a book at all. Maybe I should be doing, an article path, which is most certainly not easier. It's just a different thing. But the best advice, and I can't thank this mentor enough. The best advice I got from a mentor was, don't push too hard on the book writing, at that early stage. And at least, this resonated a lot with me. I don't think this is a one size fits all sort of thing, but, that I might run the risk of just sort of spinning my wheels. And why not spend that time, spinning off parts of the dissertation into articles, starting up collaborative projects, that I found really exciting. So I put my dissertation down for 2 straight years. I did absolutely nothing on it. And when I finally got back to it in the summer between my 2nd and 3rd year here at AU, I approached it with totally fresh eyes, more confidence after, having the experience of going through the journal review process and getting published with journal articles. Just so much more energy, the opportunity to go back to India to do follow-up research that also injected a lot of energy into the project. So for me, putting the dissertation down for a substantial amount of time made all the difference for me. And made the process much more sort of enjoyable. The last thing I'll mention that was a really important sort of milestone in changing the dissertation to the book was the book workshop. I had a book workshop between my 3rd and 4th year here at AU. And it was just an incredible half day of getting really intensive and supportive feedback. And I gave myself 6 months to incorporate that feedback into the book before I sent it off. But the book improved dramatically from getting that kind of feedback. And even setting the date of the book workshop was really important. Just sort of, lighting the fire under my feet. I have to get this done. There's going to be a group of, people that I sort of deeply respect, that have generously given me, a half a day of their time. I need to get this thing finished. Now that I've done a couple of different book workshops, just submitted a 2nd book manuscript a few weeks ago with a co-author. And having been a participant in several of them now too, I have, stronger feelings about, how best to sort of organize those. So happy to talk about that too. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Okay, Lindsay.
This is funny, Adam. A lot of what you're saying is exactly the hitting the notes that I was going to go with. So as I was thinking about this and reflecting, I think that one of the biggest barriers is how much I was so sick of the project. Mm-hmm. And the last year, as I was on the market for 2 years and finishing it up, and it was not a linear process, like I said, and I just had a bad attitude about a lot of it. And so when I started my job here at Colby, I also did not touch my dissertation for a while. And I think that was good. I'm being at a liberal arts college. I actually just focused on setting up my courses in a way that I did the work that I could make them kind of run on their own afterwards. I think that was a really good investment because it pulled me away from the nitty gritty of the thing that I gotten my head stuck into and made me think about what is interesting for an undergraduate about political science and Latin American politics, which is a good headspace to be at when you're working on a book, right? To think about why do we care about things. So I put it aside for like 8 months or something. If you're not, at a liberal arts college and you can't afford to put it down for that long, I think starting a new project, like something with a co-author, I think that would be a really nice way to do something fun. And so I had this bad attitude. When I came back to work on it, I had also set up a book conference that was going to be at the end of January 2015. The date is going to be important here for a reason. And so I'd set it up, and so I had the time. I had to get my book ready over that next year, and I was just torn that I felt like my book had to be big. Like that's what I knew about a book is it's big, it's important. I had my dissertation, and it was like, how do I make my dissertation bigger or more complex? But I didn't know what that meant, and so I tried to make it more complicated, and that made it messier. So I did all the stuff of like tearing apart the structure and trying to build up new chapters. I put a lot of time and thought into ways to redo it. I have the book conference. So it's scheduled for late January. And early December, I was pregnant. And I had very bad first trimester where I was extremely sick. My brain was just like mush. Like I could not think, I could not do anything. I just laid and moaned a lot and slept. And so I had all this stuff that I was going to do in that lead up to the book conference that I couldn't get done. And so I undid a good amount that I had ambitiously tried to completely restructure the entire project and said, well, this is good enough. And I hope they don't hate it. And it turned out that a lot of the complicated new stuff that I did, they hated, and they wanted me to go back to something like what I'd had for the dissertation. I had made it worse by overworking it. And so having a little bit of that outside perspective, it was super helpful to hear, you know, what would be the big parts about it. And a lot of that was figuring out how to say what my contributions were, to kind of frame it in a bigger way, but not necessarily to make everything complicated. I also thought maybe I need a whole bunch of new cases. I had 4 cases, like, and so they were saying, what are you doing? You're not, don't go do more field work. Don't get new cases. 4 cases is plenty of cases. And so having these outsiders sort of pull me back was really useful. I got really stuck in my head is a lot of it that I couldn't see what was going on. The book conference was really useful for that reason. I also just had a wonderful, really just supportive group of people who the tone was a really nice tone. And so they said, okay, here's what you need to do to make it better, and just take what you have and make it better instead of doing all these other complicated new things, which I think is exactly what I needed to hear. If you're not at an institution that can afford a book conference, and like a lot of people, I bet probably most people here are not going to be at places where they can just be like, oh, let's have $10,000 for a book conference. I've seen people do it where they pair it up with a conference. And so they have people on like the first day of APSA, they'll ask people and they'll just spend a day of APSA together doing that. I think a lot of people want to help, right? Like it's become a trend where you pay people to participate in the book conference, but I don't think that's necessary, especially if you're at a place where you don't have the budget for it. And so I would think about what can you replicate, even if you're not doing the flashy book conference, that you can get that experience. The other part about being really sick of it, oh, by the way, by the time I had my book conference, like that week, I had more or less gotten better, which was amazing. So that was life. It's like the first week I hadn't thrown up. So one of the things that happened with that, you know, I wasn't able to finish all the revisions before I had my baby in August. And then after I had my baby, a lot of my relationship with my work shifted, and I came to appreciate a lot of it more. But the other thing that really changed is that I started up a daily accountability group check-in with a couple of friends. And so with Jessica Rich of Marquette and Alice Kung of Nebraska. And basically every day we just check in and say, what were you gonna do? And then what did we accomplish at the end of the day? And it's a really simple thing, but what it did is it connected me with people, because my community here, like in my direct community of political scientists, was small. And when we're much harsher on ourselves than we would be on anyone else. And so I would feel like, oh, I didn't write enough today, or I got stuck on something, or I can't believe I only wrote 1 paragraph. And when you hear somebody else say that, you would say, well, yeah, but you were teaching 2 classes today. Or yes, but like yesterday you did this amazing thing. We ended up kind of making little comments we did this over a Google Sheet. And so we would give comments, and it really shifted my relationship with my writing. It made me just think of like, what can I get done today, and see my work through the lens of other people about how to treat myself with a little bit more kindness, and how to enjoy the process. I think that that's sort of the crux of all of this, of not motivating yourself with guilt, but thinking about, you know, how do you build something up? And that's the toughest part to do, but I also think is the most important, because if you're just motivating yourself with guilt and feeling like you're good enough, why do we do that? you know, like this is our job. This is supposed to be fun. Yeah. So that kind of model of thinking about how do you shift the relationship. But I think that would have not been possible for me to do right away because I needed some time to decompress from it all.
Great, thanks. I'm going to turn to Elizabeth, and then Dave, my list of questions for you now has gotten pretty long. So rest up here while Elizabeth's talking, and then we're going to turn to you. Elizabeth, please.
So everything that Adam and Lindsay said really resonated, especially, you know, you would think that since I have this role at the Monkey Cage where I'm constantly telling people, cut words, make 3 points. I mean, I'm sure David will also be saying something similar, I would guess, like simple and clear is better. And yet I'm even thinking about my own book draft and how I just am like adding things all the time, making it more complicated. And I totally did that with my dissertation to the point where I actually took 2 years and an intensive summer's worth of Russian because my dissertation the prospectus was supposed to be US and Soviet cases. And I finished the US cases and my committee was like, okay, you're done. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you can do that as a second project. So like, I mean, we are so much harder on ourselves and overly ambitious. And I've never been that great at starting simple and keeping it simple. It's way easier to tell other people to do that. So it's not just you if that happens to you. So going from dissertation to book. So I want to just preface this by saying that my daughter turned 10 last week, and I was struck by when I was reviewing the Jim's guidance for this panel because I got the first copy of the printed copy of my book, like that moment when you hold it in your hands, 3 weeks before she was born. So that's just a measure of like how long ago this was. So my advice is really out of date on the nuts and bolts. But I will say also that I am acutely aware with every passing year from the financial crisis to the pandemic of how lucky I was to be going on the market when I did. And that's just a complete accident of what stage I was at in the year that I went on the market. So, you know, I had a lot of really important structural advantages, and I appreciate that now more than ever. The deficit that I had was that I came out of a totally different discipline, and what I didn't know about political science, like the substance, even after grad school, like after I finished, and also about the profession, just does fill libraries. And so my approach to turning the dissertation into a book was to basically do what I had done all along, which is just to ask people lots and lots of questions in the search, in the grand quest for the template. Like, what is the template? What's the roadmap for how do I do this? There must be a way that this is done. And so I asked 1 million people and I got 1 million different answers, right? And I learned that there isn't, for this particular thing, or at least there wasn't back in the day, there was no one way that you approached publishers. There was no one prospectus format. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because it means that, you know, within the bounds of being professional and all the stuff that you would do anyway, you have a lot of opportunity to kind of shape how you approach that process. And I always say that, you know, I think back on this completely non-strategic, like it all looks like it was really smooth, but I was totally not strategic about any of this. It's like this profession is essentially your reward for managing one opaque process is the opportunity to participate in another completely opaque process, right? So first you have to form a committee, then you have to find a topic, then you have to actually write your dissertation, get through the defense, and you go on the job market, and then you maybe get a tenure track job, then you have to try to get tenure. And then, by the way, once you get tenure, no one tells you all the stuff that happens after that either, right? So all those phases are just opaque, and you gotta like figure it out. So the best solution to this problem is, and the best advice I would ever give anybody is get yourself a mentor like Jim Goldgeier. That's basically how I turned my dissertation into a book. So I was lucky enough to land my first job at GW, where Jim was for a long time a senior professor. And I I didn't have the opportunity to put my dissertation down, but for what was a nice reason, which was that I got a postdoc. And so I felt like I had to spend that year turning my dissertation into a book. And boy, did I wish. I mean, I was so tired of that project. I didn't want to look at my dissertation anymore, but I had to, because that was the time that I had to do it. And when I finished that and I arrived at GW, I have this vivid memory. I don't know if you remember this day, Jim, but I printed out like the whole thing, double-sided, but I did print it out. And Jim happened to come into my office and he said, well, what's that? Because, it was like many inches and even double-sided. And I said, well, that's my dissertation. And he said, oh, and he literally took it off the printer and said, I'm taking this. And I said, no, you're not. What? Like, no, you can't have that. And he said, I'm taking it. I'm going to read it. And then we're going to talk about how you're going to turn it into a book. And I cannot tell you the value of like, just the confidence booster that was at the time when I'd already been slogging on the thing for a year. I see in the chat that Hillary Matfest had this great question about what do you do when you have a 3-paper dissertation and you're trying to package them into a book? And Adam and Lindsay sounds like they had sort of similar issues. I had the complete opposite problem, which was the good part was my dissertation could only ever be a book. Like it was, and that's not because I was strategic at all. It's just that the way my book was structured with all these case studies that fit together in this very particular way, I spent most of my postdoc year trying to like kludge together one article. And it was very hard to do that because that wasn't the natural way that my argument, and I had to figure out which piece of it could be an article. And then I finally had a draft and I sent it to a journal, and you know who they sent it to as a reviewer, even though we were already in the same department, was Jim. And he also came in my office and was like, did you write an article called whatever? And I said, yeah. And he said, they just sent it to me to review, but I'm going to say that we're colleagues and I can't. So anyway, it was rejected. So I think this is a great question, Hillary, and I think all I can say is that it also applies in reverse, right? So, that was a big challenge for me. So basically, having asked all these questions of people, like, how do I do this? I just ended up saying, okay, here are the presses I think I'd like to try. And I'm just going to make a prospectus and send it to them. And, and from there, it sort of like all worked out. But it became clear to me that, the number of pages in my prospectus, like all the stuff that you sort of stress about when you're doing it and exactly how you approach the editor, it is not, like, again, within the limits of professionalism, like there's no one template unless, and at least there wasn't 10 years ago. And David and Jim can maybe speak to that a little more. And the last thing I'll say, and I think that you're probably getting this message from all of us in different ways, is the social piece of it. So I didn't have quite the same writing group. I so wish I did. And I have also done the accountability check-in, as a professor working on things. What I did have was the like complaint channel, like the, oh my God, and not even complaining about real things, just complaining about how much, like even my husband, who is not in this field at all, but does a lot of writing. Like there are just days when we come downstairs when we're done and for dinner, and like, why does like writing, why is it such, it's like, it stinks to write for a living sometimes. Like it just is like so hard. And I do enjoy writing, I do. But there are just days when you are just, you've cleared your calendar. The ones that kill me is when I have cleared my calendar, which is not an easy thing to do with 2 young children, even not in a pandemic. And I write like 4 sentences. And that will happen to you over and over and over again over the course of your career. And it doesn't get any less frustrating. And then there are the days where I only have an hour and I write one awesome paragraph that turns out to be crucial. So, it sort of balances, but writing day in and day out, it's super hard sometimes and you go through phases. So find your people who will be willing to just let you send a like writing rage text or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't even have to be that they give you feedback, but they're in the trenches with you, and they know, you know, that they understand it in a way that people who don't do this for a living don't like have a harder time understanding. So find your people. That's like a huge key to being able to stick with it and come back to it. So that's my guide to mastering opaque processes over and over and over and over again. That's
fantastic. So, all right, Dave.
All right, I want to start with something that am I on?
Let me put a couple questions to you, and then you can respond to anything that you've just heard as well. But I just wanted to get a set of questions on the table for you. And as I do so, just want to note that, you know, we've had 6 books published in the Bridging the Gap series, and 3 of them are revised dissertations. Jeff Friedman's War and Chance, Catherine Harold's Delta Democracy, and Rupal Mehta's Delaying Doomsday. Questions that I have for you, you know, sort of common challenges that you see for scholars seeking to turn their dissertations into a book. We also got a question that I had as well. When should authors reach out to an editor at a press? I mean, what's your advice regarding seeking an advance contract or submitting a complete manuscript? I have a question for you about multiple submissions. I know that varies with different presses, but, you know, what's your advice for authors as they're sort of thinking about whether or not they should submit to multiple presses? And then 2 questions that have come up that I was hoping, one that Elizabeth mentioned that came from Hilary Matfis, who just announced yesterday that she's taking a tenure track position at Korbel School at University of Denver. And so we're very excited for her. And she wanted to know about sort of thinking about leveraging a 3-paper dissertation into a book, and sort of what are you seeing from people in terms of people contacting you who've written the dissertation as a set of articles, but are thinking about potentially turning it into the book. And then the one other question I wanted to pose to you from Hilary's soon-to-be colleague already at Korbel, our Bridging the Gap co-director, Naz Barma, had a question about journal articles carved out of the dissertation, sort of your thoughts on what are the pros and cons of putting out journal articles that are based on the argument and some of the empirics of the dissertation. So it gives you a range. And like I said, please, anything that you want to respond to from what the other 3 have said.
Very quickly, I'm going to start with your last question and kind of jump into the more general questions before that. There have been, and I've gotten a couple of notices in the last month about if you publish a journal article before the book comes out, the UK's Open Access Initiative, which is tied to the EU's Open Access Initiative, will require the book to be open access. And now this is a debate going on right now, and it really hasn't hit the United States yet. And so it doesn't really affect me so much, but it affects the larger press because we have a lot of UK-based editors. But this is something coming down the road that everyone in publishing is paying attention to. There are a lot of things on there's a lot of talk, particularly within the EU, about making anything that's gotten funding from them being open access. So just something to think about in the future. I wouldn't worry about it now. It's really nothing for you to worry about as much as something for me to worry about, in the sense that I won't be able to publish books unless I get a subvention to publish them. It's something which is concerning, but again, not your problem. But getting back to kind of like the basics here, one of the things that Lindsay mentioned was this idea, write your dissertation as a book. That's kind of those are 2 things that are kind of at cross purposes with each other, because generally when you're writing a dissertation, you're writing it in kind of the defensive crouch mode. That is, you have to prove to people who are actually being paid to read your dissertation, they're not paying you to read it, that you actually know your stuff. And so that generally necessitates an author including a fairly substantial literature review within the dissertation fairly early on. And when you're transforming it into a book, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that happen. So you have that. Another thing that happens, particularly with political science dissertations, sociology dissertations, not so much history dissertations, is that the chapters are written in a pretty modular fashion. That is, they are, it's one case after another. They could be rearranged. They could be arranged in any order and almost wouldn't matter. And then finally, there's a conclusion, which is just a summation of what you've said before. And that's pretty typical of dissertations. And there's a lot of requirements at universities now to get out quickly, finish your dissertation in 5 to 6 years. So, I mean, as a consequence, dissertations are gonna need a lot of revisions before they go into a book. So the thing I look at, is, have you gotten rid of that literature review? I wanna know what you have to say, not what you have to say about, what you have to say about your topic, not what you have to say about what other people have said about this issue. Are you putting forward the big idea boldly, or is it buried in a lot of caveats and what have you? Now, you don't want to be overly bold, obviously, but I need something to hang my hat on when I'm, trying to get marketing to buy into, the fact that this book is actually important and, will have an audience. And is it arguing against, something that, is something approaching dominance in terms of, a viewpoint that has an element of dominance within the field? If so, that's really important. So, I mean, for me, because that means I can actually go to my editorial board and say, hey, look, this is going to change how we think about a particular issue. And so all of those things I look for in a project. And tied to that is the idea that there should be connective tissues in between chapters. That is there a logical sequence to the book that I, as a reader, can readily discern? Is it taking me from point A to point B to point C to a crescendo at the end where I say, this book really pulled it off? So those are all things you don't really necessarily do in a dissertation, but which a book ideally should do. And that's why you're going to have, I would say, a pretty substantial interval most of the time, not always, but most of the time between, the book and the submission of a book manuscript. One of the things Jim asked was, when should people get in touch with me? I'm fine with them getting in touch with me early on, saying, hey, look, I have a lot of work to do on this, but here's the basic idea. And I'll be like, yeah, that sounds great. Just keep me posted on it. I'll recommend, if they can, having a book conference. That's always really helpful. And, down the road, if we establish a conversation, I'm not getting this blind. And I tend to remember the people. So I think approaching people early when you have confidence in the project, I would say post-dissertation, not before you finished, is certainly not a bad thing to do. With regard to multiple submissions, I'm fine with that. The issue, when it becomes an issue, is when someone says they didn't just submit it to OUP in Princeton or OUP in Cornell or OUP in Cambridge. It's that they've submitted it to OUP, Cornell, Cambridge, and Princeton, or anything more than 2. And I'm already looking at, all right, we're all more or less the same in terms of prestige, the ability to grant tenure. Do I want to go through a whole review process when I know 3 other presses are in the mix here, when I know that there are other books that I can pursue where I'm just not going to have to deal with that? So I would say that you're welcome to submit it to as many people as possible. Obviously, you're not under contract with any of them. But when you decide to do a multiple review process, assuming the presses are okay with it, and I'm certainly okay with it, I would probably limit it to 2. But, other people might feel differently. It's just a lot of work, on my end. And there's a cost to it. I have to pay reviewers. It's time consuming. So that's something that I would keep in mind. Those are the big things. I mean, I want to stress though that, when you write a proposal and in the cover letter, make sure that the big idea is up front. Something that will make me or any editor kind of turn their head and say, this sounds interesting. This person is trying to hunt some big game here. That's, again, you don't want to oversell it, And you don't want to, this is a common thing where people will compare their book to, to Guns, Germs, and Steel or whatever. You want to do anything like that. But if the idea is something that is bracing, don't sell it short. Because I tell you, any editor will tell you, the first thing we see is the cover letter, and we look at the abstract for the proposal. And so many of our decisions are based upon that, simply because we get so much. And if there's difficulty trying to get into what this argument is, it's too easy for us to say, probably not for us. So those are things that I would recommend. I welcome any questions.
Well, that's great. So we do have a bunch of questions, and because we have several questions on the same theme, I'm going to start with this theme, which is how much had to be overhauled between the dissertation and the book. So there's several pieces. There's sort of several questions there. One is, how much additional work had to be done? Did it require additional field work, additional cases? And not just for the three professors, but for Dave as well, sort of what, when you see a manuscript, sort of your own inputs on, okay, well, this is good, but, we'd want you to do X, Y, and Z. And it may be particularly important for people during this pandemic who may have, finished dissertations doing less field work than they had anticipated doing because it got cut short, and they were still able to work with their committees to finish a dissertation, but they're going to hope to do some additional field work when the pandemic's over in order to expand into the book. And then I would say, connected to that and sort of thinking about the overhaul and the additional work and maybe additional field work is the point that at least one of you raised, which was, you're sick of the project at the end of the dissertation. You want to do other things. Lindsay found some co-author to do a fun project with, but you also want to get the thing out. And so how do you balance, okay, I'm really sick of this, but I've got more work to do and I've got to get that done because I really got to get this out so I can move on.
Can I speak to that, Jim?
Please.
A couple of things. In my experience, not in every case, but books that are manuscripts that are barely revised dissertations tend to struggle in the review process. I almost say, I've been doing this for a long time, it's almost a general rule. And if the book ultimately does get published by us or someone else, the author will probably have spent more time in the revision process than they would have if they had had a friendlier process, i.e. non-peer review process to go through on the way to the final endpoint. So there's that. And secondly, your question about, how much does it change? I will send things out for review where both reviews are mixed. And there's 25 pages, single spaced, of what this person should do, including adding material. And I still will believe in the project and say, hey, author, here's your chance. Do you want to follow through on this? Some people will say, no, I'll take it elsewhere. But other people will actually do the work. And it's, I'll get the manuscript, 15 months later, and I'll send it back to the reviewers to see, if they felt that the author has executed their recommendations well enough. And, it's usually a positive outcome at the other end, but it can be a pretty prolonged process because of the review process.
Mm-hmm. Others wish to come in on that in terms of the additional work they had to do and balancing that with being sick of it, and any thoughts on the sort of COVID impact as well. Elizabeth, we'll start with you and then see what Lindsay and Adam want to say.
This is a great question. And it's kind of related to the, going back to the dissertation, like, how do you know when you're ready to go to the archives or to the field or, and I can remember when I finished, I asked a bunch of people. I mean, this is sort of like, it's an opaque process. And I got everything from send it exactly as is with no revisions to the press you want to send it to take 2 years off and don't, and publish other stuff. And the best advice I got was, it's your project and you have to be comfortable with it. Like it's not going to be completely finished, but you have to be open to doing what the reviewers say, but you have to be comfortable with it. And it's very hard to, that can enable people. And I've fallen into this trap myself many times of just holding on to it too long, but don't let people push you if you really feel there's work to be done. I added a little bit more empirical material, but my problem wasn't so much the empirical material as the framing and the theory. And, when David was talking, I was remembering that, you have to be open to what people find interesting about your project that may not be the thing you find most interesting, or the angle or the framing. So my book is called Leaders at War, and the story of how it got to be called that is kind of funny. The dissertation was called Wars of Choice. And I thought this was really a book about military intervention. And I put a tremendous amount of effort into the research design and the like DV, right? Like a DV driven, dependent variable driven project. And to the extent anyone knows about my book, they think it's about leaders, the IV. And that was not how I thought of it at all, the whole time I was working on it. So, but that's what people find interesting about it. And, who am I to say, right? And it still basically says the same stuff, but the framing is maybe a little different. And that's partly to do with all this feedback I got. And, so just be aware that how you fit into this space of stuff is, there's some people who have the grandmother test problem. Like, how do you explain to your grandmother why this is important? I had the opposite problem, which was, how do you explain to your grandmother, like, why all of IR thought leaders didn't matter for so long? Like, I had to set up the foil for, so they're just, everybody's challenges are different, and but just be open to a new, like, I spent a lot of time on the framing in the first 2 chapters. I did open heart surgery on those. Like, that's what I was afraid of Jim seeing that day, was the kind of like intermediate state of all that stuff. But I don't think that I could have told you that I was going to write a book about leaders, even on the day I submitted my dissertation. And the last thing I'll say that I think is extremely important, and that no one really ever, you read books and they have bumper stickers or phrases or key things that are named, right? And terminology is extremely important, and it's an important area of innovation. It's what people take away from your project. And that takes a long time, and you might go through multiple iterations of that, and that's fine. It's fine to have for a long time, I called my IV transformative types and non-transformative types. In the book, it's transformative interventions and non-transformative interventions. And it wasn't until I was on the job market writing cover letters, where you're forced to put this all in one paragraph, that I realized that was tautological. And I hadn't written it tautologically, but naming it that way meant that my DV and my IV were conflated, and I couldn't call it that at all. Like, it was just not going to work. So you may be revising stuff that seems really big, but actually is just sort of like, you've written it the right way, but you've called it the wrong thing. You have to be open to that kind of thing. And that takes a long time to sort out. And it's okay if that shifts at the very last minute. I mean, I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, I cannot believe I've been carrying this terminology along for like 3 years. How could I be so, stupid? But there's no there's no terminology class that you can take to magically come up with excellent bumper stickers, right? So, and if there is, please sign me up, because I really need it. I'll stop there and let Lindsay and Adam jump in if they want.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah. So I also want to make sure that what I was saying, where like a lot of what I'd had in my dissertation, that I didn't want to make it too overcomplicated, that lesson, somehow it wasn't that the book was ready at all. I had to take what I had there and then fix, like, the skeleton was right. I've been worried about the skeleton instead of worrying about like the flesh and the bones. And so similar to what Elizabeth was saying, that like the biggest thing that I look back at it now, and I don't know how I didn't have it in there, but the dissertation doesn't talk about the contributions at all, like barely. It doesn't talk about I mean, it sets up a puzzle sort of, but it doesn't say, okay, people in the institutional change literature, here's what you're doing right now. There's this other part that's missing. Here's what I have to say about that. Here are tools that other people can use. And then, so I went through and I developed that for like 3-4 different literatures, and making it not just, oh, people haven't talked about the thing that I'm talking about as much. Like, that's not enough. You need to be developing something that people can carry away from your book and use. And that takes a really long time. Same thing with Elizabeth, like terms. Oh my God, that's like the stuff. So many things of like figuring out what the 2x2, what are the labels inside the 2x2, and is going back and forth on that. So when I look back to it, you know, the contributions was missing, but a lot of it is that I would say something like in the theoretical framework. Most of the work was in the theoretical framework. And then that was what I had to carry through 3 empirical chapters, because the structure of it is that I have 4 cases and each of them applies theoretical framework. Same thing as Elizabeth, where like, I could not figure out what the heck the articles would look like for a long time, which is why my book and the articles from it all came out the same year, because I couldn't submit them until the book was mostly done. I didn't know what I was doing. So a lot of it I'm just fleshing out, but it's funny how you can just work on the same section on the dependent variable for like 6 months over and over again. And yeah, so it's a thing of like figuring out what do you need to flesh out and why, and when adding more writing helps clarify it instead of making it more confusing. And that just takes a lot of iterations to go through. So this is one thing that,
one quick 2-finger on that. It also takes an underappreciated skill, which is you have to be willing to jettison your own writing. Like it is, and killing your darlings, or whatever you want to call it, because you're going to have some beautiful paragraphs that are not going to end up in your book. And, you know, David will make you take them out if you don't do it yourself, but better to, you know, there's some stuff I thought was so essential and it's totally on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, it's something that would be like a footnote at best for other people, but for you, you had to go through that to figure out what the linkage is between this thing and that thing. But you had to do it. Doesn't mean everyone has to see it. And this is one of the things that I don't know what the generalizable implication is for this. But the reason that I would have been nervous about doing my proposal earlier, I did it when I was mostly done, well after the book conference. And why, you know, I first sent out one of the articles from my book in 2013, and it was rejected by a couple places. And I just decided to like leave it until I had worked at the book more. And the things came out before the book was out, like they have to be out before the book was out. But I came back to it like years later, and then I was able to figure out how to do it. I didn't know the way to pitch it, like what would go in that cover letter that would convince the editors. And so that was the stuff that I had to work on, how to say that concisely in a convincing way that wasn't muddled, to figure out why would people care who aren't interested in the specific, like my book is on participatory institutions, but I wanted the primary audience not to be the people who study participatory institutions. And so how do I get those people in? That took a lot of time and a lot of iterations for me to figure out what worked. It's funny because you look back at it, like in some ways not a lot has changed, and yet it's so much better that.
Adam?
Yeah, just really, really briefly, and to reiterate a little bit what I, had said earlier. I mean, first and foremost, my dissertation was that sort of hybrid model where it was a little bit closer to different articles, and only maybe 1.5 of the chapters in my dissertation actually found its way in some way, shape, or form into the book. There was substantial rewriting, substantial reorganization, and more follow-up field work in India. I mean, I think, in terms of time, I probably spent much more time sort of revising dissertation into the book than writing the dissertation. And I certainly spent a lot of time on the dissertation too, but yeah, and a lot of that was exactly what Elizabeth just said. I mean, getting comfortable with, clicking on, several pages and just deleting them and having to just part, with things that, some things that I've never, haven't had a chance to turn back to, at this point. So yeah, just a ton of rewriting. incorporating a lot more from the ethnographic fieldwork that I had done that didn't make it into the dissertation, but I really wanted to, have the foundation of the book, at least in the case of my project, to be sort of more deeply qualitative. And so that took a lot of time to sort of, spin that narrative, and go back to the interviews and the ethnographic fieldwork, and, reconstruct the book in that way. So it was a major overhaul, but yeah, as I mentioned, it would have been a disaster if I had tried to, I think, immediately turn to this right after I defended my dissertation. For me, at least, I really, really needed to put it down, think about reorganizing it, let it, the ideas marinate a little bit, and build, more confidence about the publication process, through, publishing articles and doing collaborative work, presenting on the work, to different groups of people. So that was a really important process for me.
Great. Well, we have one question that I'm actually going to take, although I'll be interested to hear Dave's thought on it. And that's from Naomi Green Riley, who notes that this is being hosted by Bridging the Gap, which tries to bridge the gap between the academic and policy worlds. And as academics, our primary audience is the academic world. But she's asking if we want to speak to the policy world, how do we balance the contributions, and how do you think about getting policymakers understanding your work? It's been one of the interesting things about doing this book series, because, especially for people who've written dissertations, it's hard to do that in this series, because the dissertations, you're being judged on your contribution to theory. And, we always say for manuscripts for our series, and we're not looking for books that are primarily about making a theoretical contribution and then have a couple paragraphs at the end on what the policy implications are. These really are books where the policy questions are baked in from the beginning. There's an effort to use theory to answer them, but they're really about answering policy questions. I'm under no illusions when it comes to books about policy makers reading books. And so I think, although I do think it varies and, certainly depends on what we mean by policymakers, but thinking about the policy community writ large, I think we're really talking about taking a book project and finding other ways to get the ideas out in other shorter, more digestible formats that speak to the real policy contributions. And then, people who want to take a deeper dive can then go to the book. Dave, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that as you think about the series that we're doing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that I don't expect some overworked Senate staffer to pick up a book published by Oxford University Press that's 275 pages on whatever issue. But if the book really does fit the model that you just described, it's probably more likely than your standard political science book to maybe get excerpted in the Atlantic, go in the monkey cage, or go into foreign affairs, or have an excerpt in, a chapter modified into a foreign affairs article. So, and that will bring attention to the book in its own way too. So it's almost as if the basic argument and, driving theme of the book itself is what makes its series applicable, regardless of whether, someone in government who has a very, very busy job is going to be able to find the time to do it, to read it. But they may read the article that another publication, which is interested in policy-oriented material, will take on. So there are different ways to reach that audience. And it's probably easier to reach that audience if you've published a book in the series with us for, an editor at a publication like that to take notice.
Great. Well, there are two other questions I want to get to from folks who've been posting before we close out here. One has to do with the book workshops, because it's been mentioned several times and somebody asked, what is that? Typically the book workshop is a time where you can put in front of an audience of, usually, I don't know, sort of, 3, 6 people or so on. Usually it's a day. You're asking for help. Typically the theory chapter, a couple of the empirical chapters, maybe some other feature of the book. Maybe you want to have a session on the methods. and you're bringing, you know, some combination, as Lindsay pointed out, can be hard depending on the place you're in to bring people in from the outside. Some places provide resources for you to do that. Her point about doing that affiliated with an APSA or an ISA conference or something like that is a great one. And
or Zoom. I mean, Zoom is
now Zoom, right?
Yeah.
And so, but there are questions. You know, a lot of times people ask me, you know, when's the best time to do one of these? You know, should you really already have the thing done? Should it be have gone out for review already with the press? And then one of the questions we got was, how do you use the book workshop to help you with securing a book contract? So just any thoughts you have about the right timing, or Dave, from your standpoint, you know, I assume authors are telling you, hey, I'm going to be doing a book workshop on this at this.
Yeah, I tell them to do the workshop first, because the Venn diagram between the sort of reviewers I'm going to approach and who's in your book conference, they're pretty almost entirely overlapping in terms of the type of person. So I just feel like you're giving yourself a good head start and putting the best foot forward out in the review process. The book conference is going to happen anyway, right? So unless you desperately need to have that contract right away, I would probably do the conference first, and then make whatever revisions you're going to make over the next 3-4 months or however long it takes, and then submit it.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the book workshops? Okay. All right. I lied. I now have 2 more questions. So one from Kendra Kuhl. Okay, if you have, like, keeping track of sources and evidence and things that didn't make into the dissertation, but could be important for later, did you have things that you had worked on that didn't make it into the dissertation, and then 2 years later, you're like, oh my gosh, I got to go back and track that thing down for the book? And Elizabeth, since we spent years at Syracuse with you, you know, telling people how to think about their future selves, and why their future self should be, you should make life easier for your future self, who's then going to come back to deal with your present self. Maybe you want to take that one. And yeah.
Sure. And, you know, with the caveat that I always say my dissertation was all dead white men, basically, because it was all Cold War high level policymakers, and they were mostly men, and the cases are from pretty far back. So what that means is I didn't interview people, I did archival work. So all my sort of storage and stuff had to do with that. And I'm sure that Lindsay and Adam have thoughts about how to do this in the context of field work, which is pretty different. But yeah, so when Jim and I used to teach this module on archival and qualitative research at Syracuse, I would always say, like, try to think of your future self. And I would say that I fell into this because I'm pretty, you can ask my family, I'm like the stereotypical absent-minded professor. I forget things. I have to kind of like write notes to myself. And I know enough about myself to know that if I don't write it down in a way that would be accessible to other people later, it will not be obvious to me why I did this. And when you're in the archives, especially if you have a limited time, and I did this sort of like I didn't go sit in one archive for a year, which some people do, depending on their type of project. I did, you know, a week here, a week there, and then so I had very limited time, and it's very stressful. And there's no way that you'll remember why you took this picture versus that picture. So, I mean, the upshot is I would keep a log that was very sort of, as detailed as I needed to be in order to access the material and write and give it the proper bibliographic citation. And if there was some funky thing about something, I would write a note in all caps, ENS, take note, or something like that. And then when I got home, I would process it in a way, like, you want to be able to get to the point where when inevitably Oxford University Press comes to you and says, okay, so you have this quotation on page 210 and there's a typo in it. Is the typo you, or is the typo in the original? You need to go and check the original, And you don't want to spend a week trying to find that. And it's the same. I mean, if Kendrick, if you wanted to go and write a paper based on the document on page that was the basis of whatever point you make on page 210, you need to go find it. You can't spend a week digging through all this stuff. So you have to come up with some system, and everybody's project requires a different system, but you want to spend some time upfront investing in that so that you can quickly and easily retrieve information. And that applies pretty much to everybody. And, you know, I'm happy to, I have in the past given like an hour and a half seminar on just how to do that for archives. Everyone's system is different. Technology has changed, but the principle is set it up and stick to it, and a little effort up front will save you so much time on the back end.
Adam or Lindsay, anything to add to that?
I was going to say, I have to sign up for your course on this or talk on this, Elizabeth, as someone that's a little bit more disorganized. But yeah, just so immensely important, especially, you know, I'm sure Lindsay has the same experience. You know, you're writing field notes down, you know, quotes of things that you're not, you know, from interviews where you're not able to do recordings. You know, you really want to keep your notes as detailed and legible as possible, you know, typing them up. And one thing I've tried to do much more and benefiting from taking some anthropology classes in graduate school is also write about how I'm thinking about the project and how it's evolving along with my field notes. And that's, you know, also an interesting sort of source to look back. You know, how was I sort of understanding that particular scene in that context? How's my thoughts on this particular thing evolving? So yeah, staying organized for our future selves is such a great message.
So I'm going to close. I love this question from Alicia Ellis, and I'm going to read it because it's put so well. How do you get out of being overly protective of your work? I always feel the need to keep my research right into myself until it's perfect. The find your people is great, but what about the dread in revealing the imperfections of your work when it's scrutinized by others? And Dave, I actually want to start with you. Like, are there moments when you have to pry the darn thing out of the hands of your authors who are just not ready to give it to you yet?
Yeah, I mean, I usually roll out the old cliche, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And it really is. I mean, in the sense, nothing's ever going to be perfect. There are going to be mistakes. And the only way you're going to find out about the mistakes beyond the ones you've identified, and which you may be wrong about, it may be fine, is for other people to look at it. So, you know, I don't have a whole lot to say about that, but yeah, people can hold on to things too long. Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on the feeling overprotective and not ready? I mean, and it's true for everything, right? It's not just the book. I mean, articles, I mean, it just can be very hard to let them out there in the public.
Well, Jim, I should follow up. I should have mentioned one thing. There's a book that may or may not be in our series. I know it is in our series, in which the author was very, very protective, and I had to kind of pry it out of his hands, and it eventually came. But there was a lot of coaxing, a lot of the argument being that, hey, we've actually scheduled this. We're doing pre-sell-in now. We're assigning a publicist to it. We got to know, that sort of thing. So at a certain point, you know, you start to try other tactics.
Lindsay?
I wrote a little thing because I also really like this question. And just saying, sometimes just starting to talk about things, that's easier, or setting up exchanges. But the other thing I just thought of, and I don't know if this is going to help other people, we know that women often hold on to things until they're perfect. Not to say that men don't, but this is something that does end up expressing in a gendered way. And given that I know Alicia also, so knowing that she is also a woman, that I think of it as a feminist act. And I'm like, I'm helping the sisterhood by pushing back against it. Sometimes this is, or sending my articles out, you know, not holding on to things until they're perfect, because what if they're rejected and I'm not ready yet? Just sometimes just sending it out and thinking like, the game is actually for me to do this. And so this is how it's supposed to be. And am I falling into gendered traps here? So that somehow makes me step outside of myself and helps me do it. I don't know if that trick would help anyone else though.
Elizabeth?
I would say this is something that you have to think of as a skill that you will get better at over time. and that's not something I really appreciated. Again, I feel like you get to this point where it sounds like you knew this all along. Like, I did not know this all along. I had Jim take it off the printer, right? I didn't want him to read it that day. I definitely held on to things too long for a while, and I learned how, it just takes practice like anything else. And the monkey cage has made me better at this, because my first monkey cage piece before I was an editor, I wrote a few things, and it was based at GW. Like, the editor-in-chief had the office next to me, so it was, I'd say, do you want a piece on this? And he'd say, sure. I would agonize. It took me a week to write, and then I would wordsmith it, and he would send it back to me in an hour. And I was like, how do you do that? And when I became an editor and I had to start turning these things around so fast, now I understand how he got it back to me in an hour, because he's experienced, and I'm a lot more experienced now than I was then. And I can write those kinds of pieces more quickly. I still hold on to things, too much, but for probably too long, but I've gotten better at it. So there's no substitute for kind of practice. And the other thing I would say is when David said, you may be wrong, we all kind of know where the flaws we think are in our work. Like, I know where all the bodies are buried in my book, but that doesn't mean you know them all. And people with different perspectives are going to find different flaws and care more. And the reviewers might care about something that you've never thought of and not notice all the stuff you think is wrong with it. So you do have to be comfortable. Like, there has to be kind of you have to get over the threshold of being ready to send it out. But no one expects that a manuscript is perfect. And you might as well know what other people or the people standing in the path of it getting published really think are the big flaws. And you're never going to fix them all. I mean, we don't do physics, we do political science, and there's hardly any like perfect, this is a complicated set of things that we study. So don't assume that and this is one of those things that's so much easier to say to other people, again, than to yourself. What Lindsay said is so true. We're all so much harder on ourselves, but the things you agonize over, people might not even notice, and they might notice other things. And so you might as well find that out.
Adam, you have any 30 seconds to?
No, I mean, Elizabeth put it so well. I mean, really mirrored what I was going to say, that this is a process. I mean, something that I certainly work on and would like to think I'm getting a little bit better at, but, looking at it through the lens of, you're going to get feedback often on things that you just don't even anticipate. And it always makes the paper better, or makes the manuscript better, and trying to sort of take that attitude to it.
Well, this has been really an amazing session. And Lindsay, thanks for inspiring me last year when I read the book for that award committee. And, all of you have produced such amazing work. The books you produced are phenomenal. Dave,
thank you for organizing this, because I mean, it's so affirming to think that like it wasn't just me, right? Like,
well, it's really clear from the comments that have come in that people, it meant a lot that you opened up, as I hoped you would, as I knew you would, to really describe some of the challenges that you faced. Even as you produced amazing work, in the end, there were lots of challenges along the way. And to Dave, who's not just an amazing editor, putting out lots of great books, he's also just an amazing mentor as well to his authors. And so, Dave, we really appreciate everything you do at Oxford University Press, and all the authors that you've helped mentor along the way. And I just close by saying, just in case anybody thought it sounded monstrous that I took Elizabeth's thing off the printer to go read, that I just say to other, senior scholars that, it's just really important to be constructive and to be helpful. And, you recognize that you're, the PhD students, the junior professors, even, senior colleagues, are always struggling as they're producing their work. And so be as helpful as you can to them to help them work through the process. So with that, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. And good luck with everything. And to everyone out there, let's get through this pandemic and stay safe, be well, and look forward to seeing folks in person before too long. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim.